A contemporary reading, Earth's Desire by Thomas Berry. To be seen in her loveliness, to be tasted in her delicious fruits, to be listened to in her teaching, to be endured in the severity of her discipline, to be experienced as the maternal source whence we come, the destiny to which we return. For divine wisdom in contemporary expression, we give thanks.
Hear words of faith from the book of Amos, chapter 5. I despise and reject your feasts. I am not appeased by your solemn assemblies. When you offer me burnt offerings, I reject your offerings and refuse to look at your sacrifices of fattened cattle. Spare me the racket of your chanting. Relieve me of the strumming of your harps. Instead, let justice flow like a river and righteousness flow like an unfailing stream. For the glorious revelation of God in creation, we give thanks.
Let justice roll down like a river. Those words come alive for us today in this great movement. It's one of the great gifts, I think, of the ecumenical movement, this season of creation which touches people throughout the world and which we can all unite despite the other things that we might be divided on. Originally, these words come from the prophet Amos, who lived in the 8th century before Jesus, so a very different time from our own. They're part of his denunciation of the then northern kingdom of Israel. But his words have been applicable to many contexts of injustice and sacred betrayal since. Martin Luther King, for example, quoted these words in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Because whilst not all of Amos's phraseology and underlying work is entirely straightforward for us, it is hard not to be moved by this enduring cry that he calls out. Firstly, about justice. Secondly, about the sovereignty of God. And thirdly, about the consequent judgment, you can put it in inverted commas if you like, which results from the neglect of justice and relationship with God and others. And they are, I think, the key theological themes that continue to run through the centuries and run through for us, not least in their environmental challenges. So as we begin this season of creation, let me briefly open these out for further reflection. First, as I say, Amos seeks to recenter us on justice at the heart of God. Not a court of justice where we're being punished, but about justice in all its elements, not least ecological justice. Note well, this is not encouraging people of faith to throw away the task of developing good doctrine or healthy spiritual practices. The season of creation is not just about Christians jumping on the environmental bandwagon as if it is the only thing that matters. But it's rather about recovering the intimate relationship between God and all that exists, that is, the big picture within which the ecological struggles sit. In that sense, it is also about a call to healthy, renewing worship and teaching, as well as about saving the planet and other good works. Because when Amos attacked the worship of his day, he wasn't doing so because such things in themselves do not please God and express God's love in us, but because good worship and good understanding of God have to be entwined with sharing in justice. What is at stake here is relationship on this big picture. Inward, outward, everything comes together. and it needs to do. This month, we're trying to run some study series on Tuesday evening. You're all invited to that, will be online, called Reading the Bible with Ecological Eyes. And that's seeking to invite us all into deeper reflection upon the nature of relationship, divine relationship with creation at the heart of the world and this season. Because, as Amos affirms, justice for human beings or for the planet is intimately connected. One helpful way to look at this is through the repeated refrain of the Hebrew Scriptures, where God says again and again to the people of Israel, "You shall dwell in the land I gave your forebears, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God." Land, people, God. Three elements together, biblically speaking. No wonder Aboriginal pastors talk of the Hebrew Scriptures as a tribal book. Land, people, sacredness, fit together. That's the ancient worldview from which we've departed. If you mess one up, you mess the others up. For where people ignore the sacred, they and land suffer. Where people only care for what they call God, ignoring land, they and the land suffer. And where people are ignored by others who care only for their land or their gods, the land and everyone suffers. So, like other biblical prophets, Amos is saying, we can only find flourishing, whatever age we live in, for people and land when we are in right relationship with God, with the sacred. So this brings us, secondly, to the sovereignty of God, the centrality of God, if you prefer. Because to be quite honest, it's a little bit uncomfortable, isn't it? In Amos and in the Hebrew Scriptures in many places, we are called to honor the particularity of the God of biblical tradition. This particular God, not any old God. Because in Amos and in chapter 5 itself, the prophet speaks out strongly against syncretistic worship and theologies which have developed among God's people. Now, as moderns, we may be understandably resistant to this. After all, we may reasonably say, do not many other spiritual and even quite secular wisdom traditions have something to share to help renew our relationship with God and God's creation? And yes, they do. But we have to look at these things in context that Amos is speaking about. Just because you talk a lot about nature, just because you talk about a mother God, doesn't mean to say there's justice. Any more than if it's a patriarchal religion. So Amos is challenging us not to be tribal in the narrow sense of trying to impose our faith or anything on others, but not to be just let anything go in our worship and our theologies. Rather, he is encouraging us to assess how far anything in any faith or culture, how far it reflects the heart of God and contributes to renewing this essential relationship of God, land, and people. Because if we are honest, all of our various traditions, wisdom traditions, were shaped by worldviews and technologies that have long since gone. We are in a different space. So all of our traditions, all of our Christian traditions have things in them that are negative for us and for the land, but they also have profound strengths, as in other faiths. If we were to join together and work through that, to rediscover what really matters. This leads us, thirdly, to what is traditionally called the judgment of God, of which the prophet speaks. And Amos is quite clear about that, like the other prophets, not least in the verse that comes immediately before the ones we heard. Truly, he says, the days of the Lord will be darkness, not light, gloom without any brightness. Well, there's almost certainly some hyperbole here and heightened language for dramatic effect. But Amos is surely right in the sense that where the relationship of the sacred and land and people isn't healthy, there are consequences. That's what judgment really means. It's not something from outside or in a courthouse when we die. It's about how things work. If you don't relate properly, there are consequences, and then you might feel judged. That's the feeling you get. The chickens come home to roost, we might say. Or in more contemporary terms, the birds come home to rest only to find that climate change has robbed them of their food and habitats. Or the penguins and the polar bears come home to breed only to find that the ground beneath them, the ice, is literally melting beneath them. So what the ancients called the judgment of God, we may understand in more scientific terms as well, but it is deeply real. So unless, this is the message, I guess, of the season of creation, unless in spiritual and theological terms we repent, unless we share in what John Paul II called ecological conversion, unless we change our ways of thinking and behaving, unless we renew true relationship between the sacred, the land, and people, suffering will continue. Amos is primarily concerned to express that message. And we should note the significance of the fact that he wasn't born into being a prophet or a priest or any other kind of religious figure. He was actually a sheep herder and a sycamore fig farmer. But he was driven to speak out by the consequences of injustice and false, distracting religion. Now, very likely, when you think about that background, his background, the consequences were also environmental, including driving people like him from their homes because he could no longer make a living on the land. It was impossible to live like so many people today. Not for nothing, I think, does the book of Amos mention an earthquake at the beginning of the book of Amos. It's like a symbolic expression both of how Amos comes to us and his message, and also the holistic message of divine salvation, about the breaking apart, as it were, of the earth itself. So who is Amos for us today? Are our ears open to the cries of pain by similar people who are driven from their land, from their farming or tending of trees, their livelihoods, who share earth's sufferings with us? We too, whoever we are also called to be prophets like Amos, whether or not we have a religious sort of attachment or not. We are called to speak of the realities of justice at the heart of God and of God's intimate relationship with land and people, with all that exists. All of that brings me in conclusion to desire. What a wonderful word desire is, which can be misused, of course. But it's a word that we often don't associate with the earth. We're at distance from it. Desire, what the brilliant Catholic priest and geologian Thomas Berry called Earth's desire, that we heard about in that poem. What Berry was saying is that we need to approach ecological relationship, God, land, people, in terms of love and desire, because the relationship has to have love and desire in it to really grow, as well as justice. So this complements for me the overall picture of God which we find in these prophets' expressions of anger and longing for justice. Because such anger and the call to justice, where do they come from? They come out of love, the divine love at the heart of existence. So we might not speak of judgment in the same way as the ancients, but it is the consequence of not honoring this sacred love at the heart of all things. So the remedy is partly, as Berry says, with the best of the Bible, to grow in holistic love, beginning with opening ourselves afresh to the love of God, not just for people, but for the whole of creation, and sharing in earth's desire and sacred desire. So this brings us back to a renewed understanding of God, as well as God's wider creation, and brings us back to healthy worship and spiritual practices. From these, in renewing our mutual love and desire with earth and God, said Thomas Berry, we can grow in deeper understanding and enable us better to bear justice for all creation. Because human beings, let's think about it, only really love that which we're in relationship with, don't we? If we don't know about others, we don't really care. We don't do anything about it. But when we enter into relationship and share with them, it makes a difference. Think about it. Today is Father's Day. Makes a big difference. Most fathers, not all, respond, and people are responding to their fathers today. Similarly, if we're not in relationship with the earth, then it's not surprising. That's why desire is important. So I hope that this is what the season of creation can also enable us in terms of prayer and worship and understanding. And to take the next step, I invite you, therefore, to share in reflection now upon often unseen wonders of the love and beauty of creation.